belong to a series of satirical vignettes depicting famous public places of entertainment in London, but they also provide one of the most frightening adventures and one of the most dangerous attacks on the heroine. At that point in the story, the reader has been made aware of all the potential threats lurking in public places, which provide men with further opportunities to prey on women, and the dazzling appearance of Vauxhall can no longer deceive us. Though the arrival at Vauxhall begins as another comic scene in the wake of the comedies of manners with Mr. Smith and the Brantons, yet it already sets the following adventures afoot, building up a strange, dreamlike atmosphere, paving the way for the sudden shifts and metamorphoses to come. Burney is preparing the reader to witness another instance of male violence, cracking the veneer of civilized politeness. True enough, the mixed character of the crowd of Vauxhall was well known, as was the bad reputation of the dark walks. Yet the choice of a formal public garden, still bearing the influence of the geometrical French designs, to reveal the presence of hidden pockets of disorder, is anything but accidental. The issue of order and disorder in public places is addressed through a reflection on nature and gardening. Now the scene starts then as another comic scene, the extent of the Brantons' bad taste, revealing the extent of the Brantons' bad taste. Evelina, the narrator, constantly underlines the contrast between the dazzling setting and the low characters occupying it, as amply shown before. At first sight, the trip to Vauxhall seems to usher the reader into a comedy of manners. The low bickering of the Brantons has by now become a defining trait, and their absurd quarrels about how they should spend their evening out is turning into a running joke. Just a few days before the night at Vauxhall, Mr. Smith and all the Brantons were so divided and unable to agree on where to spend their evening that Evelina had just left them without any satisfying answer to give to Madame Duval. Here, they are fighting once again, this time over the when and how they should go. The heroine again takes the stance of the outsider, the satirical spectator of absurd scenes. She sets herself apart, establishing a safe distance, as appears with the use of the dashes and the doubling of the punctuation marks surrounding the "and me," line 3, or the use of the deictic "these" and "these people," line 4. And the exaggeration in, for example, 20 disputes, line 5, reveals this satirical mood. The point is to show the absurdity of the characters from the beginning. The satire is aimed at the class of merchants who envisage everything in terms of money and profit and who are utterly unable to join in the aristocratic spending of money, who are unable to observe the aesthetic and fashionable conventions of the higher social classes. Evelina divides this excessive focus on money, which prevents the Brantons from simply enjoying the evening. This appears through a series of contrasts. For example, lines 52 and 53, quote, much fault was found with everything that was ordered, unquote, is opposed to not a morsel of anything was left. And their conjectures on the profit made are out of place in the context. Their mercantile approach points out the role of the pleasure gardens in the commodification of culture, with the oboe concerto, which seems to be put on a par with the food provided for a price, at least from the Brantons' perspective. And in Vauxhall Garden, the entrance fee paid and the possibility to hire a little band of French horns to play to people while they were eating, as mentioned by Warwick Roth, contributed to the view of music as a commodity. In Evelina, the stress laid on the contrast between the setting and the characters implies a criticism of that mercantile view, and I feel I'm repeating Pierre again. And this criticism shows how this mercantile view both spoils the character's pleasure and exposes their lack of taste. The Brantons' obsession with money largely contributes to their utter lack of manners also. Mr. Branton's behaviour is anything but gentlemanly when he heavily insists on the favour he is bestowing on Evelina, exclaiming, "This must have been a fine treat for you," line 63, and then hammering it in with, "Why, I suppose you was never so happy in your life before," line 65 and 66, while of course he should make light of it. His choice of the word fine is also revealing. He is trying to show off, to impress Evelina with his gentility, but his very efforts, of course, then betray his lower origins. Miss Branton's exclamation, "I like Vauxhall because it's not vulgar," line 62 63, epitomizes their attitude with much irony. The very fact that she says that proves her to be vulgar, of course, and on top of it she says that just after they have all shown just how vulgar they are. The social clash is further underlined by the contrast between Evelina, who enjoys the hautboy concerto above anything else, and the Brantons, who are merely interested in the food and in more artificial and less tasteful attractions like the cascade, which, as is explained by Vivian Jones in her notes, was dismissed as the tin cascade, and it was dismissed in the Connoisseur. So the Brantons are all about appearances, aiming as usual at appearing to advantage, while remaining unable to discern the true value of the place. The Brantons' breaches of good manners are then all the more comic, are they are utterly unable to perceive them and fancy that they do appear genteel. And once again, their vulgarity is set off by contrast with the heroine, who shows true politeness, unobtrusively speaking to Monsieur Dubois to oblige Madame Duval, while Mr. Smith is pestering her with his excessive assiduity. The text then seems to lay the stress on the importance of civilized manners and social order, implicitly reasserting social hierarchies. Yet there is more to this scene than the question of manners. The Brantons' continuous arguments undoubtedly expose their low breeding, but they also jar in the harmonious setting, undermining the view of Vauxhall as an enchanted place. The dazzling appearance of Vauxhall Garden is presented as deceptive from the beginning, paving the way for unpleasant shifts and metamorphoses. When Evelina exclaims, "I could have thought myself upon enchanted ground," line 22, the combined use of the modal could and the highly subjective have thought suggests how unreal this conjecture really is. Evelina seems in a way under a spell, seeing herself as the heroine of a fairy tale, but she could not be more wrong. Her excessive enthusiasm lends the whole scene a certain unreal, dreamlike qualities, with hyperboles, for example, lines 18 and 20, or the accumulation, line 17, which convey a strong impression of plenty and splendour. There is also the fact that Evelina perceived the hautboy as heavenly. So this heavenly musical moment, which was shown by Pierre Dubois to participate to the view of the gardens as a safe haven, this is what is going to be disrupted afterwards. And here at the beginning, the emphasis is laid on appearances. The company make a most brilliant and gay appearance, line 18. The scene of the cascade is described as extremely pretty, striking and lively. And Evelina's subjectivity is also repeatedly underlined, showing that the shiny cover might be hiding an unpalatable reality. In this paradise-like setting, the characters are no angels. It is said that the heroine has no gentle spirits to associate with, line 23. The shift in the social class enables Evelina to discover the darker side of London, laying bare the delusions of her naive enthusiasm. And this is made clear from the moment when she starts her second stay in London. The defamiliarization of the place is meant to reveal her, quote, romantic illusion, unquote, as she calls it, page 174. With her newly discovered relatives, the gay and busy appearance is replaced by, quote, a look of gloom, fatigue, and lassitude, unquote, still on the same page. Now, keeping this in mind, the reader is led to beware of Evelina's enthusiasm, and the dreamlike setting is paving the way for the shifts in atmosphere and tone with the attack in the dark walks. Though the place seems enchanted, first of all, there is no Prince Charming. Mr. Smith appears as the knight in reverse here. His officious assiduity is only impertinent, and his forcing Evelina to follow him. And this is the point where really starts the sadistic rewriting of the fairy tale, with the repeated transformation of prince into dragon, to take up Susan Freeman's perspective. And this is then already paving the way for Sir Clement's metamorphosis from the rescuing knight to the predator. Evelina is also deceived in her perception of the evening as a pleasant gay spectacle. Though she safely enjoys the concert as a spectator, she is quickly turned herself into a comic show. She becomes the spectacle, diverting the Brantons. In her words, quote, they enjoy her first sight of her various other deceptions, lines 49 and 50, and, quote again, her surprise and ignorance proved a source of diversion to them all, unquote, lines 43 and 44. Here, once again, she is against her will cast in the role of the country bumpkin of the Comedy of Manners, as in the box at the theatre when she was compared to Congreve's Miss Prue, and when she became a source of diversion for Mr. Lovell, at the very moment when she thought she could safely enjoy the show as a spectator. And the sudden shift occurring at Vauxhall from passivity to action, the heroine is made to run, and from the spectator's seat to the centre of the stage, could be said to be a recurrent device in the novel, which further contributes to the dreamlike atmosphere of the scene, with the sudden disorder wreaking havoc in the apparently civilized and quiet entertainment of the company. In this particular text, the consequences of being turned into a spectacle are even more damaging than usual, since, ironically, the men later on claim that the reason why they are attacking her is that they thought that she was an actress. Now then, when Evelina writes that this seems, quote, a place formed for animation and pleasure, lines 19 and 20, that animation seems to take a very concrete physical turn, with the crowd suddenly running. The characters are there to be entertained, but what diverts them is chaos and riots. The bell puts the garden upside down. It no longer seems the same, suddenly becoming all astir. The emphasis is laid on movements and swiftness, lines 34 to 42, and the scene is described in terms evoking a riot, with Evelina wondering, quote, what had raised such an alarm, unquote, line 42. And this perspective is highly revealing. This is a place where disorder is always lurking around the corner. And here it is fashion and dazzling shows that bring chaos in the apparently civilized world of pleasure gardens. Now here, though there is nothing to be truly alarmed about, the running of the crowd eerily calls to mind the actual riots that Tom Brantons enjoys so much. He alludes to the folks running about, line 72, at the last line of the season at Vauxhall Garden. And as Vivian Jones and Warwick Roth point out, Burney is alluding to actual violence and to very real attacks that could take place in Vauxhall. But what is even more disturbing is the parallel that seems to be drawn here between that violence and organised public entertainment. In the text, Tom Branton's enthusiasm is conveyed in his speech, which is rendering the chaos of the moment, with the dashes, the accumulations, the exclamations, and in his description of the riots at the end of the season. And the danger is that the riotous diversions of Vauxhall might be an excuse for real attacks. In the Dark Walks, too, the men are highly entertained by Evelina's running, and they force Biddy to run too. The boundary between public entertainment and predatory behaviour is here indeed very thin. Mr. Smith's forcing the heroine to run also foreshadows the attack in the Dark Walks, and adds to the web of images of women running because of men's predatory assertions of power, which culminates in the old women's race, as was pointed out by Christina Straub. The heroine's running here initiates a defamiliarization of the place with a loss of landmarks, and this is a recurring feature in Evelina as a whole, and indeed in all of Burney's novels. Evelina suddenly runs and loses her relatives in Marybone Gardens, and she no longer knows where she is. And this loss of landmarks leads inevitably to male attacks. And this is also the case in Cecilia, when the heroine starts running in the streets in a disordered fashion, looking for Delville, and gradually losing her mind. In Burney's works, the heroine's running seems to function as the crossing of boundaries, typically ushering the Gothic heroine into a world of nightmare, opening up Gothic possibilities. Here, the sudden change in Evelina's surroundings is paving the way for the discovery of the Dark Walks with their callous, almost Gothic villains. The contrast between the civilized appearance and the boisterous entertainment, turning the whole place topsy-turvy, reveals the hidden presence of disorder, always ready to resurface. And this ambiguous relation between civilization, order, and chaos is further explored in the description of the pleasure garden itself, raising the question of the link between gardens, nature, and freedom. Evelina's remarks on Vauxhall echo contemporary concerns. As Vivian Jones puts it, it reveals her more modern taste for less formal garden design. Addison and Pope, and Evelina refers to Pope, largely contributed to the evolution of the aesthetics of the gardens in the 18th century. And here, just give a very general basis. They rejected the geometrical forms of French gardens in favour of the reproduction of the disorder and wildness of nature. For example, in the Tatler number 161 in 17 and 10, Joseph Addison fancied himself in a dream in the Alps and wrote how he found that the happy, varied and wild regions was inhabited by the goddess of liberty. So already the link between wilderness and freedom. And in that place there was a profusion of flowers which, quote, had a greater beauty in their natural luxuriancy and disorder than they could have received from the checks and restraints of art, unquote. Nature is then associated with disorder, while the ordering of art appears as a lack of freedom. Describing this ideal landscape, he laid the ground for new aesthetics, with the emphasis on natural wildness, variety, irregularity, and with his preference for open fields, free of fences and enclosures. He was already paving the way for the sunk fences or ha-has of landscape gardens, which enabled the eyes to roam free without the visual boundary of the fence, and giving importance to the prospect. Here, it's quite clear that Evelina is embracing this new view, and this appears in her rejection of Vauxhall in favour of Kensington Gardens in London and the prospect of Prior Park in Bath. Kensington Garden was designed by Bridgman, who dammed the Westbourne stream to create a serpentine line, And he also replaced the traditional fence with the sunk fence to divide, to mark the separation between Kensington Gardens and Hyde Park. And Prior Park was landscaped by Capability Brown, perhaps the most famous landscape gardener of the age. So this shows Evelina's taste for modern English landscape gardens as opposed to the classical geometrical forms of French gardens whose influence could still be felt in England. She writes that she finds Vauxhall too formal, and she rejects this imposition of geometry and symmetry on nature when she criticizes the straight walks. She is quoting the epistle to Lord Burlington, in which Pope describes Timon's villa as huge and out of proportion, and in which he writes about the garden, "On every side you look, behold the wall. No pleasing intricacies intervene, no artful wilderness to perplex the scene. Grove nods at grove, each alley has a brother, and half the platform just reflects the other." Like Addison, Pope saw beauty in irregularity, with the presence of sudden rises, falls, turns of ground, winding walks, ruins. And he also valued nature's wilderness and emphasized the importance of letting the eye roam beyond the garden itself, to embrace wider views. And this appears, for example, in his letter to Martha Blount. Evelina's quotation is then meant to reveal her taste for more modern is also meant to criticize the artificiality of Vauxhall. The formality of the garden is associated here with a lack of freedom. The formal setting could be said in a way to be reproducing the rigid restraints imposed on women and the sudden disruptions of the apparently civilized surface offer a vivid image of the double standard ruling the relations between men and women, showing how the rigid laws walling women in enable men to roam free. Evelina's description of her arrival at Vauxhall conveys a strong impression of enclosure. For example, in the and me that is set apart, the use of the dashes could also evoke visually, could also form a kind of visual embodiment of the straight lines confining the heroine. She is not in control of the situation, and Mr. Smith is taking advantage of the belle to take control over her. From the beginning, it is said that the trip to Vauxhall itself is the result of his carrying his point, line 1. And again, he forces Evelina to move while she is struggling to escape him. So then the geometrical forms which predominate, both with the straight lines and also with the circle of the company around the orchestra, are in tune with the impression of confinement. The image of the encircling crowd prefigures the ring of men attacking the heroine later on. Men, on the other hand, feel free in that setting, and that freedom is associated with impertinence, line 26, and with riotous disorder. What Tom Branton particularly enjoys in Vauxhall is seeing women run skimper scamper, a view that the men attacking women in the dark walks seem to share. Interestingly, the lack of freedom of the French garden designs was also associated with French absolutism. For example, in the description of the Alps, Addison mentions a river which, quote, after having made its progress through the three nations, stagnates in a huge lake at the leaving of them, and no sooner enters into the regions of slavery, but runs through them with an incredible rapidity and takes its shorter way to the sea, unquote. The winding serpentine line of the river is here clearly related with the freedom of Switzerland, while the straight, direct route to the sea is linked with French tyranny. Now then, imposing geometrical forms on nature was perceived as close to French despotism, while lack of symmetry and irregularity offered a compromise between art and nature, closer to the mixed nature of the English constitution. Or, to take up Michel Barédon's words, le mauvais goût provient de ce que l'on a choisi la route de l'a priori, jeu de mots portant sur la méthode axiomatique de l'école cartésienne, et de ce que l'on a imposé à la nature un schéma géométrique conforme au despotisme du roi Soleil. Prôner la symétrie et l'irrégularité signifie que l'on est ami des libertés civiques et partisan de la constitution mixte. In Evelina, the criticism of the groves nodding at each other may be understood as an allusion to that view, further pointing to a lack of freedom. The straight walks evoke the influence of the French despotism, or more generally speaking, the heroine's desire for more modern gardens, in which geometrical forms are no longer imposed on nature, is here explicitly related to a desire for freedom, and the English gardens come to embody a compromise between savage nature and despotism. But, as we have seen, Bernays seems to give this view a twist. Though geometrical forms are indeed equated with lack of freedom, here it is man's despotic power that is castigated. As the adventure in the Dark Walks reveals, men can freely impose their wills and attack women in Vauxhall or even elsewhere if they feel like it. What appears highly contradictory is the way nature and women are firmly held in check by man's hand, while men themselves are allowed to return to a kind of lawless, savage state, giving in to disorderly or more atavistic impulses. Though French symmetry and order are rejected in the gardens, what Bernays criticizes above all is the impression of civilized order hiding men's inherent savagery. While gardens should be less formal, men should be more so. And here I'm going to talk about Monsieur Dubois again. Interestingly, Monsieur Dubois, the French, whose name evokes trees and groves, is the only man Evelina voluntarily addresses herself to, because he is civil and respectful, line 28, which shows how the civilized restraint imposed on nature in gardens would be more fruitful if applied to men. Men's freedom in the gardens appears only as a corruption of the pastoral ideal. Complete innocence in that context can only put women in harm's way. What Evelina's view of the gardens then reveals is the need to achieve a balance between art and nature, which is one of the key issues in the novel as a whole.